By May of 1862, the South's dream of creating a country separate from the United States appeared doomed. After several victories the year before, the young Confederacy soon had lost enough battles and strategic locations to make its independence seem like a fading ambition. Early in 1862, two Confederate forts had been seized in Tennessee. Fort Pulaski on the Atlantic coast had fallen to Union control. New Orleans had surrendered. Rebel forces were turned back at Pea Ridge, Arkansas, and at Shiloh, Tennessee. And more than 100,000 Federal troops had Corinth, Mississippi under siege. On the Virginia front, Union General George McClellan, with his massive 120,000-man army, edged closer to the capital of the Confederacy in Richmond. 22,000 Yankees, commanded by General John C. Fremont, pushed through the rugged mountains of western Virginia. Another 18,000 men, commanded by Union General Nathaniel Banks, massed north of the Potomac River. These two forces, those of Banks and Fremont, were poised to strike the Confederacy's major artery, its lifeblood, a valley just 75 miles west of Washington, D.C., known as the breadbasket of the Confederacy, the Shenandoah Valley. Its importance as an agricultural and logistical asset to both sides during the Civil War made it a priority for North and South. The Federals knew that if Fremont and Banks could unite in the Shenandoah Valley, then McClellan would likely take the Confederate capital of Richmond for the Union. It appeared that Abraham Lincoln's administration was on the verge of crushing the year-old Southern rebellion. But what Lincoln didn't know was that in Virginia, one determined man stood in the way of a swift victory for the North. This God-fearing soldier would be a nemesis to Northern armies and commanders for the entirety of his short-lived Civil War career. To relieve the Union pressure on Richmond, this man would put into motion a now legendary military campaign that is, to this day, heavily studied for its boldness and strategic genius. This man was General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, and at the small mountain town of McDowell, he would shift the tide of the Civil War in Virginia. A West Point graduate and Mexican War veteran, Jackson was assigned to the Shenandoah Valley in November 1861 after establishing himself as the Confederate hero of the First Battle of Manassas, Virginia. In the chaos and horror of that fight, Jackson's Virginia Brigade held firm in the battle. It was observed that Jackson's men stood their ground like a stone wall, thus earning their commander his legendary nickname. In the Shenandoah Valley in early 1862, however, Stonewall Jackson's small command of just more than 2,000 ill-trained militia and cavalry faced an even more daunting task: protecting the region from the huge Federal Army massing north of the Potomac River. Winter had not dampened the Federal spirit, and Jackson knew his enemy would soon be approaching. He withdrew south, but noticed an opportunity for a surprise attack, while Union commanders reallocated their troops. With some of his Confederate units marching an amazing 27 miles in one day, Jackson moved his boys rapidly northward to strike the unsuspecting Yankees at Kernstown, Virginia. But the Confederates had underestimated the Federal strength, which was more than twice the rebel side. Low on ammunition and nearly overwhelmed, some of Jackson's units retreated. Amidst the chaos, he watched as 200 men of his old Stonewall Brigade were captured. Despite Jackson's loss at Kernstown, his goals of keeping the Yankees off balance were fully met. The general was well aware, however, that the Shenandoah Valley would continue to be under threat. As expected, in early April 1862, Union troops in western Virginia started moving toward the Shenandoah Valley. In response, Confederate General Edward Allegheny Johnson and his men retreated east. Similarly, Jackson and his army retreated to Swift Run Gap. Meanwhile, the Federals' suspicion of a rebel attack caused Union General Robert Milroy to temporarily halt his march into the valley. With Milroy's men no longer advancing, Jackson saw an opportunity to move west and confront the Federal thrusts. But Jackson needed support to keep an eye on the Yankees while he and his men moved west. So, under the command of General Richard Ewell, 8,500 Confederates entered the Shenandoah Valley and headed toward Jackson's location. Ewell's division reached Jackson's camps on the night of April 30th. The next morning, Ewell and his troops awoke to find only the smoldering embers of the campfires left behind by Stonewall's army.
He is as crazy as a March hare. He has gone away, I don't know where, and left me here with instructions to stay until he returns. But Banks's whole army is advancing on me. I have not the most remote idea where to communicate with General Jackson.
Once again, Jackson appeared to be embarking on another deceptive plan. Jackson was marching his army south, giving the impression that he was leaving the Shenandoah Valley. In fact, not only had Jackson misled Union troops and Northern spies, he misled even his own men, who were convinced that they were moving to aid in the defense of Richmond. However, after arriving at Meacham's River Station, Jackson piled his soldiers into railroad cars and immediately returned to the Shenandoah Valley. On May 2nd, sensing Jackson's deception, Union General Banks wired General Fremont that he suspected an attack on his troops by Johnson and Jackson. 2 days later, steam locomotives loaded with Stonewall's gray-clad legions rolled into Stanton. Still, Jackson's plans remained unclear, even to his own men. If silence be golden, he was a bonanza, wrote one observer of the Southern general. Johnson's 2,800 men marched to North Mountain on May 6th, followed by Jackson's columns that leave Stanton on the morning of May 7th, marching west along the Parkersburg Turnpike. By mid-afternoon, Union pickets encountered the marching rebels, and the Federals withdrew hastily to the crest of Shenandoah Mountain. Johnson splits his force to envelop the Federal position on the mountain. In response, Union General Milroy ordered Federal forces to withdraw and concentrate at McDowell. Having arrived at McDowell, the Federals prepared for battle. From his hospital bed at the Presbyterian Church, a Union soldier wrote that, "Everything is in a great hubbub outdoors. The artillery is all gone and is planted on a hill commanding the approach to the town. Cavalry can be seen riding furiously in all directions, carrying orders to and fro." The next morning, May 8, 1862, frost covered the ground in all directions. But as one witness put it, indications were that all would be warm enough in more ways than one ere nightfall. Federal troops were converging on the region, and the Shenandoah Valley was on the line. General Milroy's Yankees were up by 2:30 a.m., anticipating a rebel attack at dawn. At about 10:30 a.m., Yankee reinforcements led by General Robert Schenck arrived at McDowell. Meanwhile, Federal scouts reported that the Confederates were attempting to transport artillery to the crest of Sitlington's Hill, which would make the Yankee position on the bottomland at McDowell indefensible. There were also indications of a rebel flanking movement. The Federal commanders decided to strike first. At 4:30 p.m., about 2,300 Yankees crossed the bridge over the Bull Pasture River.
With a great shout, the regiment rushed down to the turnpike, reaching which the men scarcely stopped to take breath before they began clambering up the steep slope of Bull Pasture Mountain.
A skirt of woods concealed the initial Yankee movement. But when Jackson spotted the blue-clad skirmishers in an open field, he ordered up 4 regiments of General Johnson's Confederate brigade.
We got our position on the hill designated about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and was ordered to lie down on our arms to wait the progress of events. But in 30 minutes the cry was heard, "To arms, the enemy are advancing," and then began one of the bloodiest fights of the war.
The Federals advanced confidently and steadily, pushing back a Virginia regiment before engaging with the main line of battle on the brow of the hill. The rebels were driven up a higher knoll, but did not retreat entirely. One Georgia soldier later said, "We did not come all this way to Virginia to run before the Yankees." The Ohio regiments, leading the Federal attack, held their ground for 90 minutes alone. General Milroy, surprised at the success with the Ohioans, sent 2 more Ohio regiments to vigorously attack the Confederates. As the Buckeyes started forward, a shout rang out from General Schenck. "Men, remember that you are from Ohio."
The Confederate fire seemed only to add to the exhilaration and elan of our charge. Up through the slanting meadows went the blue lines, with colors flying and infields crashing. No flinching, forward! Some soldiers fall and lie motionless upon the grass, but there is no time to pay attention to that.
As rebels of the 31st Virginia moved toward the Yankee line, they realized they were facing hometown friends from the Federal 3rd West Virginia. Between volleys, men on both sides waved and called each other by name, all the while desperately trying to kill each other. Union forces fought their way up the steep slopes. The conflict grew in ferocity.
About nightfall, I received my first wound by a mini ball through the left arm. It was a new experience to me. Soon after being shot, I was seized with the most intense craving for water I had ever felt. It seemed as though my insides were burning out. The mountains seemed to spin around in the air like a boy's toy top. My desire for water overcame all pain caused by the wound.
Federal troops defiantly scaled Sitlington's Hill and closed in on the Confederate position. But the rebels attacked the Yankees and chased them to the base of the hill before returning to the Confederate lines. A heavy veil of smoke hung low over the field, making it hard for the enemies to see one another. Suddenly, piercing through the smoke, a United States flag and accompanying Federal troops surprised soldiers of the Confederate 44th Virginia. The Virginians broke and ran, but a colonel called to his fleeing gray-clad troops, asking if they intended to let the damn Yankees drive them from their own soil. The officer's challenge took effect, and the retreating Virginians stopped, turned, and fired, then gave 3 cheers for their home state. Meanwhile, the growing darkness of evening made for a spectacular scene.
The flashing of the guns after nightfall on the mountainside and crest amid the trees was indescribably grand and beautiful, and no one witnessing it can ever forget it. At times, sheets of flame shot from the angry mouths of the guns, lighting up the whole mountainside.
As the fighting continued, Jackson ordered his commanding officer to hold the Confederate position at all hazards. The Stonewall Brigade would soon be there to help him. However, the conflict was by then already over. The outnumbered Federals, led by General Milroy, were no match for Stonewall Jackson's rebels. In the approaching darkness, the bloodied and battle-weary Union forces assembled at the base of Sitlington's Hill and withdrew to McDowell. The rebels cheered for Jefferson Davis, for the Confederacy, and for victory. But victory was not without sacrifice. Of the 13,200 Confederates at the battle, 159 were killed and 522 wounded. On the other side, Milroy's force of about 4,300 Union men presented a determined and brave fight, with the Union reporting 28 killed, 225 wounded, and 3 missing.
Soldiers are bearing their wounded comrades off the field by the light of the torches, and here and there the dark outlines of a form, covered with a blanket marked where one of our brave boys sleeps, the unchanging sleep of death. It is a melancholy and never to be forgotten spectacle.
Notwithstanding the Union retreat, it can be argued that the Federal forces fought to a draw at McDowell. The Federals' initial attack surprised Jackson, seized the initiative, and inflicted heavy casualties. From the South's perspective, however, the Battle of McDowell was an important victory. Jackson had kept Generals Fremont and Banks from uniting their armies and taking the Shenandoah Valley for the Union, and the South maintained control of the vital railroad lines at Stanton. Giving credit to the Almighty, Jackson informed the War Department in Richmond by way of a telegraph of the success at McDowell, writing, "God blessed our arms with victory at McDowell yesterday." Jackson would ride the momentum of his win at McDowell to victories at Front Royal, Winchester, Cross Keys, and Port Republic. During and after these conflicts, President Lincoln became so concerned about Stonewall's deceptive abilities that the chief executive kept 50,000 Northern troops from aiding General McClellan's Federal push on Richmond in order to bolster the defense of Washington. Cunning Stonewall Jackson and his small but mighty army had put all of the Union, including its army commanders and its Federal administration, on edge. Union General Banks wrote to Washington from Strasburg, Virginia on May 22, 1862, "Sir, the return of the rebel forces of General Jackson to the Valley after his forced march against Generals Milroy and Schenck increases my anxiety for the safety of the position I occupy and that of the troops under my command." Meanwhile, newspapers all over the world would write about the ever-elusive Stonewall Jackson and the daring exploits of his small army in 1862. And in the mountains of Highland County, Virginia, the Battle of McDowell, a battle characterized by boldness and deception, would forever be remembered as the moment the tide of the Civil War turned in favor of the South.